Alleluia, Christ is risen. Is he? Are you quite sure of that? Personally, I would feel a great deal more reassuring if the women who had been there that morning, there in the cemetery, there at the tomb, if they had departed from that place with a bounce in their steps and hope in their hearts and faith on their lips. But they did not. They did not skip and prance from the tomb, bursting with joy. I wish I could report that to you, but it wouldn't be true. On the contrary, Mark writes that they fled the tomb seized with terror. It hardly counts as a shout of victory over death. And one has to ask, really, is this any way to stage a resurrection? Take a look. Early in the morning, the women make their way to the tomb, red-eyed and puffy-eyed from lack of sleep and grief. They pass quietly through the streets and then down the paths until they reach the place of burial. They are bearing with them spices with which to provide final, tender ministrations to the body of the one they had so loved, whose limbs they have come to caress with ointments, whose dried blood they will wipe away, and whose battered torso they will swathe with fragrant spices. Instead, they are startled by a young man, an angel, whose first words are, in fact, predictable. Anyone who knows their Bible knows that 99 out of 100 times when an angel encounters a human, the first thing the angel says is, "Don't be afraid." Which perhaps reflects on angels. Perhaps they are more fearsome than our artists have imagined them. But I suspect it has something to do with the state in which they encounter us. Afraid, worried, anxious, fretting. After all, fear is a nearly constant companion for human beings, is it not? Our ancestors slept fretfully and awoke each new day to the terrifying prospect of living among dinosaurs. Perpetually in need of food, they hunted equally hungry and desperate creatures. Powerful and swift creatures with jaws and claws and horns and hooves. Our ancestors lived with fear. And all these millennia later, despite the frozen meat section, we still exist in a state of fear. In recent years, we have been terrified together as global financial markets collapsed. Whole countries teetered on the brink of disaster, and giants of industry and finance showed a soft underbelly many of us had never even suspected. Many of us are terrified by the prospect of empty retirement accounts, the peril of losing homes, the horrors of climate change, the inability to purchase for our children the educations for which we had been saving. Before that, we were terrified by terror. Before that, there was anthrax and Y2K, the Cold War, the prospect of nuclear holocaust. And then there are the timeless worries of terrifying medical diagnoses, of vicious tornadoes and ferocious hurricanes, fear of losing jobs that provide both security and identity, and not least, always with us, the fear of old age, illness, and death. And the angel meets us and he says, "Don't be afraid." To which we are tempted to retort, "Easy, angel, for you to say." So therefore, if it had been up to me, if I had been God, I would have staged the resurrection very differently. I would have done everything possible to avoid those women running away in fear. I would have brought to the resurrection something, in fact, of the stagecraft that we have brought to this morning. Timpani and trumpets and blooming flowers and a host of people who could have seen it with their own eyes. Who would have, at the moment of resurrection, stood wide-eyed and slack-jawed and would have exclaimed with appropriate responses like, "Wow! Holy moly! Land sakes! Hallelujah!" If I were God, I would have timed and staged the resurrection to occur right in front of people whose eyewitness accounts would have thwarted forever all the speculation, all the doubt and uncertainty that has plagued this central tenet of Christianity for 2,000 years. Instead, because God failed to stage and time the resurrection to its best effect, the women miss the resurrection by minutes. They collide with an angel, let fall their precious spices, and flee from the tomb, seized, we are told, with terror. But here's the thing. They don't stay afraid. That's the story I so want you to hear this morning. They don't stay afraid. It didn't happen immediately. It didn't even happen the next day. But over time, the women and Peter and James and John and all the disciples shed their fears. Over time, they grew less and less tentative and more confident of the meaning of this morning, Easter morning. Over time, they came to experience Jesus not as the memory of one who had died, but as the presence of one who yet lived. Over time, they came to trust that the one whom God had sent to challenge the powers and principalities of this world still lives on and is still challenging the powers and principalities. Over time, they came to trust that the one who loved the unlovely and who raised up the oppressed lives on. They came to know that the one who overcomes divisions between Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female, black and white, straight and gay, lives on. Over time, so real was their experience of the risen Christ that their hearts warmed and thrilled to the assurance that death had died. On the cross with Jesus, death died. The experience of Easter, the experience of resurrection, is not something that can be arrived at in the twinkle of an eye. Not any more than the fears that plague us can be overcome by the words of an angel who instructs us, "O mortal, don't be afraid." No, Easter is a dawning thing. God chooses to relate to us not as a conjurer, but as a connector. Not as a performer, but as a presence. Not as a magician, but more as a mother. The sweet secret of Easter is this: God is more shy than showy. And God does not wish to wow you so much as woo you. God will not coerce you to faith, not even on Easter morning. No, Easter is a dawning thing. Resurrection is a dawning thing. It dawns under the power of relationship with the living Christ, whose presence we learn to see and learn to sense and learn to trust in a lifetime of discipleship and relationship. Easter is God's tender, sweet, intimate whisper. Don't be afraid. I've got you. Hallelujah. Christ is risen. If you are not quite yet able to trust that, if you cannot yet hear God's whispered assurance that death is dead, that's okay. The rest of us will believe it for you. It took Mary and the disciples quite some time to come around to it. So be patient with yourself and be patient with God and keep at it, for Easter is a dawning thing.